Hi, everyone. My name's Yvonne So, and I'm the board chair of OCA Greater Phoenix chapter. We're a member chapter of OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates, which is a national organization dedicated to advancing the social, political, and economic well-being of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. As you know, May is AAPI Heritage Month, and we spend this month celebrating the Asian American Pacific Islander community, our history, our heroes, and our contributions to American society. OCA is celebrating with AAPI author talks and book readings through our annual program, OCA Reads. Today, we're honored to host Andrea Stewart for a reading of her debut fantasy novel, The Bone Shard Daughter. Andrea is the daughter of a Chinese mom and a Scottish dad. And I know this because I receive Stuart tartan every Christmas. Our moms are sisters, and I have the distinct honor of calling Andrea my cousin. She was raised in a number of places across the United States, and her parents always emphasized science and education, so she spent her childhood immersed in Star Trek and odd-smelling library books. I also know this because every time we hung out, her nose was in a book, and I was always be annoyed at family reunions because when the Stewarts came, they always voted for a Star Trek movie for movie night. She now lives in sunny California and is busy writing her third book in the Drowning Empire trilogy. The Bone Shard Daughter was a finalist for the Goodreads Choice Awards, the Locus Awards, and the Book Nest Award. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so let's start off with some Q&A. What's one of the first stories you remember writing?
Oh, so that was actually what got me started on this whole path. My fifth grade teacher had us do a creative writing exercise about a clay figurine that comes to life and what happens. So I wrote this whole story about this clay peregrine falcon figurine that came to life and flew to this other land, and she really liked it. So that got me thinking, well, maybe I could write, and I basically commandeered my dad's old computer and started writing stories from then on.
That's awesome, starting in fifth grade. And did it have fantasy elements at that point, or is that something you evolved towards?
I mean, it did, because it was a clay figurine coming to life. So there was a fantastical element to it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And did you know you always wanted to write fantasy?
I think so. I mean, that was really what I read mostly when I was a kid. I mean, I read some literary fiction and science fiction and a bunch of other genres, but what I really started out with was fantasy. You know, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And then, where do you derive most of your inspiration?
It's from a lot of places. So some of it is just from watching shows or reading books that I really like and thinking, oh, I really like this thing that they did here. Some of it is from just real life events that I can kind of twist into an element of a story. Yeah, I mean, like, for example, Bone Shard Daughter, one of my first inspirations was when I was out to lunch with some of my friends, and my friend Marina Lostetter, who's also an author, almost choked on a shard of bone in her lunch. And I thought to myself, whoa, what if bone shards could be magic? And that was one of the things that got me started on this whole book.
And then, I guess so that kind of explains the whole process. Like, where did bone shard come from? I guess that's the story behind it. Do worlds ever collide for you? Do you ever confuse what happens in the Phoenix Empire with our everyday life? Because it's so detailed, like everything that happens in there and all the geography and the lands. Like, do you ever get out to your car and be like, oh, I need to go to this island? Or
I mean, I don't, but that's mostly because my characters' perspectives, I think, are very different from mine. So when I am writing about the Phoenix Empire, it's through the viewpoint of a completely different person than me. So I'm able to keep it separated that way.
That's so interesting, because I would be so confused. Especially since you spend most of the day immersed in writing, right?
I do. So it is my full-time job at this point in time.
And then it seems like there's a lot of Asian themes and traditions kind of dotted throughout your narratives. Is that the influence of your Chinese background peeking through? And what's the motivation of kind of putting these in?
So it's definitely a lot of my Chinese background peeking through that, and just some of the traveling that I've done.
Mm-hmm.
So I tell people, like, hey, it's not a Chinese analog, because I am pulling in some other cultures. And I also want to be careful because, I know that my experience and the way that my family does things is not the experience that everybody else has. But definitely a lot of the food,
Yeah,
there's
the
a
flavor.
lot of food in the book.
Yeah.
Families gathering to eat is like a very important thing in this world. So that was like a big thing that I pulled. Some of the familial relationships between, I think trying to live up to parental expectations is a big thing that I've experienced, and that some of my characters experience. So yeah, a lot of my background. Part of the reason I wanted to do that is because I feel like there is more now, but when I was growing up, there was not very much representation for Asian people in fantasy stories. Like, you would sometimes get some kind of Asian analog country, but their people were always described as like exotic, and they were not main characters, they were side characters. So a lot of it was like, I wanted to see people like me in a book, and draw on my background, and kind of, I think people who are growing up nowadays, it's really wonderful, because I didn't have that kind of thing when I was a kid, being able to go to the library and read a fantasy book that had people like me in it. It was all, your Western European farm boys growing up to slay the dragon kind of thing. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to add to the diversity.
That's really interesting. And then how's the experience different publishing as an AAPI author? Do you think that it's a different process for you?
So I feel like I got very lucky in that I came in at the right time. So I didn't experience a lot of friction as far as the story that I wanted to tell. I know that it's been different for other people, unfortunately. I know you and I talked a little bit about this, but Cindy Pon was kind of like a trailblazer for having Asian stories set in a fantasy world. And at the time when she published, it was a lot more difficult, and people would say things like, your character is not relatable. Unfortunately, that kind of thing still does happen. I have a friend who was querying his middle grade book, and he got told the same thing by an agent, that it was not relatable, and kids would not really be able to immerse themselves in this world because it was too foreign. Which is funny because we read all these things with like white characters, right? And we're able to relate just fine. So
like, we grew up with Nancy Drew and Little House on the Prairie, and I'm just fine.
Right. So I feel like publishing sometimes doesn't give readers enough credit. Like I said, though, I do fortunately feel like that's been changing.
And then, are there any API fantasy authors that you admire?
Oh,
that kind of paved the way
so many.
for you?
So there is Fonda Lee. Like, she wrote the. It starts with J City. There's this trilogy that came out recently, and that is actually being adapted for television. I'm very excited. I really, really enjoyed it. Ken Liu, obviously, he's written so many short stories. He has a fantasy epic out right now. There is also K.S. Vioso. I hope I didn't butcher her name. But she has a trilogy out right now. Her last book just came out, and it's The Dragon of Jinsayang that just came out. And hers is set in like a Filipino-inspired world. Ted Chiang, I love his stories. I will always push them on people. There's so many now.
Yeah.
Like there weren't as many when I was younger, but nowadays it's really great to see.
And then can you describe a little bit your writing process?
So it kind of varies from book to book. I'll usually start out with like a document of ideas where I'm just like writing a bunch of ideas down and then figuring out which ones can stay in the story and which ones have to go, which ones don't work. And then I'll usually do an outline from there, like a chapter by chapter outline. And then from there, I start writing. Oftentimes I will have to change the outline. I am working on the third book and I wrote a rough draft, realizing that it is not where I want it to be. So I am re-outlining it at the moment to do a bunch of rewrites. So it kind of varies.
When you start your first book, you know where your last book is going to end?
I know where it's going to end. It's the stuff in between that gets a little bit wobbly. Yeah. Yes. How do we get from here to here? Yes.
In 3 books. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And then do you have any tips for aspiring writers?
Yeah, I think
for writing and also for publishing.
Yeah, so for both, my first and most important tip would be to find a group of writers that are at a similar stage as you are, who are as serious as you are about writing, because not only can they provide you with really good feedback, but you can provide them with feedback as well. Critiquing other people's work, I think, is really important to understanding and analyzing your own work, like what works for you and other people's work is something you can apply to your own writing, as well as what doesn't work for you. And learning to articulate that, I think, is really important. But more than that, it's really important, I think, to have other people that you can talk to as you go through this journey to publication. I commiserated with many of my friends when I was going through the querying process and then later the submission process to editors. I don't know anybody who hasn't gone through a lot of adversity to get their first book published, whether that is finding an agent, whether that is finding the time to write, whether that is finding an editor who loves your book. And having people that you can talk to about this kind of stuff is incredibly important and is so good for your mental well-being.
And not lay people like me. I remember we're talking about it before you published Bone Chart Dog. I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Because it's so foreign to me. Yeah, that's it. So what's on your nightstand right now? What are you reading?
I actually literally have Shadow and Bone on my nightstand right now because, the television series just came out and I had wanted to read it before the television series came out. I was unsuccessful in that. I am reading a lot of ARCs, which are advanced reader copies. So one of the things that happens when you become an author is that publishers will send you the advanced copies of books because they want you to read it and to blurb it. So I've been doing a lot of that recently. I just finished reading Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Lyn Tan, and that was incredible. That is coming out, I believe, in the summer or early next year. I can't remember, but if you look it up, it'll say something about that. But that was it was a lovely, gorgeous book. So I just finished that recently, and I am trying to read Shadow and Bone. I read the first couple pages and it was really good. So.
And do you still always read hard copies, or do you do audiobooks as
well? Oh, no. Oh, yeah, I forgot. I'm also reading Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. So I tend to have one book that I'm listening to on audio, one book that I am reading on my computer, and then one book that's on my Kindle. So I usually have like a few versions going at once.
And do you want to go ahead and do your book reading?
Sure. Okay. And you can tell me if it starts to run a little bit long.
Okay.
This is the paperback copy of my book. So I'm just going to do a little reading from the beginning. And hopefully this goes okay. I have practiced. Okay, so chapter 1, Lyn, Imperial Island. Father told me I'm broken. He didn't speak this disappointment when I answered his question, but he said it with narrowed eyes, the way he sucked on his already hollow cheeks, the way the left side of his lips twitched a little bit down, the movement almost hidden by his beard. He taught me how to read a person's thoughts on their face, and he knew that I knew how to read these signs. So between us, it was as though he had spoken out loud. The question, who was your closest childhood friend? My answer, I don't know. I could run as quickly as the sparrow flies. I was as skilled with an abacus as the Empire's best accountants, and I could name all the known islands in the time it took for tea to finish steeping. But I could not remember my past before the sickness. Sometimes I thought I never would, that the girl from before was lost to me. Father's chair creaked as he shifted, and he let out a long breath. In his fingers he held a brass key, which he tapped on the table's surface. How can I trust you with my secrets? How can I trust you as my heir if you do not know who you are? I knew who I was. I was Lyn. I was the Emperor's daughter. I shouted the words in my head, but I didn't say them. Unlike my father, I kept my face neutral, my thoughts hidden. Sometimes he liked it when I stood up for myself, but this was not one of those times. It never was when it came to my past. I did my best not to stare at the key. Ask me another question, I said. The wind lashed at the shutters, bringing with it the salt seaweed smell of the ocean. The breeze licked at my neck, and I suppressed a shiver. I kept his gaze, hoping he saw the steel in my soul and not the fear. I could taste the scent of rebellion on the winds as clearly as I could the fish fermentation vats. It was that obvious, that thick. I could set things right if only I had the means. If only he let me prove it. Tap. Very well, Father said. The teak pillars behind him framed his withered countenance, making him look more like a foreboding portrait than a man. You're afraid of sea serpents. Why? I was bit by one when I was a child, I said. He studied my face. I held my breath. I stopped holding my breath. I twined my fingers together and then forced them to relax. If I were a mountain, he would be following the taproots of cloud junipers, chipping away the stone, searching for the white, chalky core, and finding it. Don't lie to me, girl, he snarled. Don't make guesses. You may be my flesh and blood, but I can name my foster son to the crown. It doesn't have to be you. I wished I did remember. Was there a time when this man stroked my hair and kissed my forehead? Had he loved me before I'd forgotten, when I'd been whole and unbroken? I wished there was someone I could ask, or at least someone who could give me answers. Forgive me. I bowed my head. My black hair formed a curtain over my eyes, and I stole a glance at the key. Most of the doors in the palace were locked. He hobbled from room to room, using his bone shard magic to create miracles, a magic I needed if I was to rule. I'd earned 6 keys. My father's foster, Bayan, had 7. Sometimes it felt as if my entire life was a test. Fine, Father said. He eased back into his chair. You may go. I rose to leave, but hesitated. When will you teach me your bone shard magic? I didn't wait for his response. You say you can name Bayan as your heir, but you haven't. I'm still your heir, and I need to know how to control the constructs. I'm 23, and you... I stopped because I didn't know how old he was. There were liver spots on the backs of his hands, and his hair was steely gray. I didn't know how much longer he would live. All I could imagine was a future where he died and left me with no knowledge, no way to protect the Empire from the Alanga, no memories of a father who cared. He coughed, muffling the sound with his sleeve. His gaze flicked to the key, and his voice went soft. When you are a whole person, he said. I didn't understand him, but I recognized the vulnerability. Please, I said, what if I am never a whole person? He looked at me, and the sadness in his gaze scraped at my heart like teeth. I had 5 years of memories. Before that was a fog. I'd lost something precious. If only I knew what it was. Father, A knock sounded at the door, and he was cold as stone once more. Bayan slipped inside without waiting for a response, and I wanted to curse him. He hunched his shoulders as he walked, his footfall silent. If he were anyone else, I'd think his step hesitant, but Bayan had the look of a cat about him, deliberate, predatory. He wore a leather apron over his tunic, and blood stained his hands. "I've completed the modification," Bayan said. "You asked me to see you right away when I'd finished." A construct hobbled behind him, tiny hooves clicking against the floor. It looked like a deer, except for the fangs protruding from its mouth and the curling monkey's tail. Two small wings sprouted from its shoulders, blood staining the fur around them. Father turned in his chair and placed a hand on the creature's back. It looked up at him with wide, wet eyes. "Sloppy," he said. "How many shards did you use to embed the follow command?" "Two," Bayan said. "One to get the construct to follow me, and another to get it to stop." "It should be one," Father said. "It goes where you do unless you tell it not to. The language is in the first book I gave you." He seized one of the wings and pulled it. When he let it go, it settled slowly back at the construct's side. "Your construction, however, is excellent." Bayan's eyes slid to the side, and I held his gaze. Neither of us looked away. Always a competition. Bayan's irises were blacker even than mine, and when his lip curled, it only accentuated the full curve of his mouth. I supposed he was prettier than I would ever be, but I was convinced I was smarter, and that's what really mattered. Bayan never cared to hide his feelings. He carried his contempt for me like a child's favorite seashell. "Try again with a new construct," Father said, and Bayan broke his gaze from mine. Ah, I'd won this small contest. Father reached his fingers into the beast. I held my breath. I'd only seen him do this twice. Twice I could remember, at least. The creature only blinked placidly as Father's hand disappeared to the wrist, and then he pulled away and the construct froze, still as a statue. In his hand were two small shards of bone. No blood stained his fingers. He dropped the bones into Bayan's hand. "Now go, both of you." I was quicker to the door than Bayan, who I suspected was hoping for more than just harsh words. But I was used to harsh words, and I'd things to do. I slipped out the door and held it for Bayan to pass so he didn't bloody the door with his hands. Father prized cleanliness. Bayan glared at me as he passed, the breeze in his wake smelling of copper and incense. Bayan was just the son of a small Isles governor, lucky enough to have caught Father's eye and to be taken in as a foster. He'd brought the sickness with him, some exotic disease Imperial didn't know. I was told I got sick with it soon after he arrived, and recovered a little while after Bayan did. But he hadn't lost as much of his memory as I had, and he'd gotten some of it back. As soon as he disappeared around the corner, I whirled and ran for the end of the hallway. The shutters threatened to blow against the walls when I unlatched them. The tile roofs looked like the slopes of mountains. I stepped outside and shut the window. The world opened up before me. From atop the roof, I could see the city and the harbor. I could even see the boats in the ocean fishing for squid, their lanterns shining in the distance like earthbound stars. The wind tugged at my tunic, finding its way beneath the cloth, biting at my skin. I had to be quick. By now, the construct servant would have removed the body of the deer. I half ran, half skidded down the slope of the roof toward the side of the palace where my father's bedroom was. He never brought his chain of keys into the questioning room. He didn't bring his construct guards with him. I'd read the small signs on his face. He might bark at me and scold me, but when we were alone, he feared me. The tiles clicked below my feet. On the ramparts of the palace, shadows lurked. More constructs. Their instructions were simple. Watch for intruders. Sound an alarm. None of them paid me any mind, no matter that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I wasn't an intruder. The construct of bureaucracy would now be handing over the reports. I'd watched him sorting them earlier in the day, hairy lips fumbling over his teeth as he read them silently. There would be quite a lot. Shipments delayed due to skirmishes, the Eye of Karn stealing and smuggling Whitstone, citizens shirking their duty to the Empire. I swung onto my father's balcony. The door to his room was cracked open. The room was usually empty, but this time it was not. A growl emanated from within. I froze. A black nose nudged into the space between door and wall, widening the gap. Yellow eyes peered at me and tufted ears flicked back. Claws scraped against wood as the creature strode toward me. Bingtai, one of my father's oldest constructs. Gray speckled his jowls, but he had all his teeth. Each incisor was as long as my thumb. His lip curled, the hackles on his back standing on end. He was a creature of nightmares, an amalgamation of large predators with black, shaggy fur that faded into the darkness. He took another step closer. Maybe it wasn't Bayan that was stupid. Maybe I was the stupid one. Maybe this was how Father would find me after his tea, torn to bloody pieces on his balcony. It was too far to the ground, and I was too short to reach the roof gutters. The only way out from these rooms was into the hallway. Bingtai, I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. It is me, Lyn. I could almost feel my father's two commands battling in the construct's head. 1, protect my rooms. 2, protect my family. Which command was stronger? I'd bet on the second one, but now I wasn't so sure. I held my ground and tried not to let my fear show. I shoved my hand toward Bingtai's nose. He could see me. He could hear me. Perhaps he needed to smell me. He could choose to taste me, though I did my best not to think about that. His wet, cold nose touched my fingers, a growl still deep in his throat. I was not Bayan, who wrestled with the constructs like they were his brothers. I could not forget what they were. My throat constricted until I could barely breathe, my chest tight and painful. And then Bingtai settled on his haunches, his ears pricking, his lips covering his teeth. Good Bingtai, I said, my voice trembled. I had to hurry. Grief lay heavy in the room, thick as the dust on what used to be my mother's wardrobe. Her jewelry on the dresser lay untouched. Her slippers still awaited her next to the bed. What bothered me more than the questions my father asked me, the not knowing if he loved and cared for me as a child, was not remembering my mother. I'd heard the remaining servants whispering. He burned all her portraits on the day she died. He forbade mention of her name. He put all her handmaidens to the sword. He guarded the memories of her jealously, as if he was the only one allowed to have them. Focus. I didn't know where he kept the copies he distributed to Bayan and me. He always pulled these from his sash pocket, and I didn't dare try to filch them from there. But the original chain of keys lay on the bed. So many doors. So many keys. I didn't know which was which, so I selected one at random, a golden key with a jade piece in the bow, and pocketed it. I escaped into the hallway and wedged a thin piece of wood between door and frame so the door didn't latch. Now the tea would be steeping. Father would be reading through the reports, asking questions. I hoped they would keep him occupied. My feet scuffed against the floorboards as I ran. The grand hallways of the palace were empty, lamplight glinting off the red painted beams above. In the entryway, teak pillars rose from floor to ceiling, framing the faded mural on the second floor wall. I took the steps down to the palace doors 2 at a time. Each step felt like a miniature betrayal. I could have waited, one part of my mind told me. I could have been obedient. I could have done my best to answer my father's questions, to heal my memories. But the other part of my mind was cold and sharp. It cut through the guilt to find a hard truth. I could never be what he wanted if I did not take what I wanted. I hadn't been able to remember it no matter how hard I tried. He'd not left me with any other choice than to show him I was worthy in a different way. I slipped through the palace doors and into the silent yard. The front gates were closed, but I was small and strong, and if Father wouldn't teach me his magic, well, there were other things I'd taught myself in the times he was locked in a secret room with Bayan, like climbing. The walls were clean but in disrepair. The plaster had broken away in places, leaving the stone beneath exposed. It was easy enough to climb. The monkey-shaped construct atop the wall just glanced at me before turning its limpid gaze back to the city. A thrill rushed through me when I touched down on the other side. I'd been into the city on foot before. I must have. But for me, it was like the first time. The streets stank of fish and hot oil, and the remnants of dinners cooked and eaten. The stones beneath my slippers were dark and slippery with wash water. Pots clanged, and a breeze carried the sound of lilting, subdued voices. The first 2 storefronts I saw were closed, wooden shutters locked shut. Too late? I'd seen the blacksmith store from the palace walls, and this was what first gave me the idea. I held my breath as I dashed down a narrow alley. He was there. He was pulling the door closed, a pack slung over one shoulder. Wait, I said, please, just one more order. We're closed, he huffed out. Come back tomorrow. I stifled the desperation clawing up my throat. I'll pay you twice your regular price if you can start it tonight. Just one key copy. He looked at me then, and his gaze trailed over my embroidered silk tunic. His lips pressed together. But then he just sighed. 2 silver. 1 is my regular price. He was a good man. Fair. Relief flooded me as I dug the coins from my sash pocket and pressed them into his calloused palm. Here, I need it quickly. Wrong thing to say. Annoyance flashed across his face, but he still opened the door again and let me into his shop. The man was built like an iron, broad and squat. His shoulders seemed to take up half the space. Metal tools hung from the walls and ceiling. He picked up his tinderbox and relit the lamps, and then he turned back to face me. It won't be ready until tomorrow morning at the earliest. But do you need to keep the key? He shook his head. I can make a mold of it tonight. The key will be ready tomorrow. I wished there weren't so many chances to turn back, so many chances for my courage to falter. I forced myself to drop my father's key into the blacksmith's hand. The man took it and turned, fishing a block of clay from a stone trough. He pressed the key into it. And then he froze, his breath stopping in his throat. I moved for the key before I could think. I saw what he did as soon as I took one step closer. At the base of the bow, just before the stem, was the tiny figure of a phoenix embossed into the metal. When the blacksmith looked at me, his face was as round and pale as the moon. Who are you? What are you doing with one of the emperor's keys? And that's where I will leave it. So that's part of the first chapter. There's a little bit more after that. Oh, I think you're muted.
Wow, you just missed like my super excited part. So I said, that's amazing. What a treat. Thank you so much. And I have a confession to make because I listened to the audiobook of Bone Shard Daughter because the book was so intimidating to me. And that's kind of my way to decompress at night. But, you know, I realized it's so much better hearing these words come from the author.
So, oh no, don't say that. Yeah. I love like Natalie Nautis. She's like amazing.
Yeah, no, she's really good. But like, I feel like these words came from your mind. And so, you know, that like all the nuances of how people are feeling at that moment. And you kind of,
but I'm also not an actor. So
yeah, that's true. But yeah, now I know why. Yeah, it's pretty amazing to hear it from your perspective. And then I just realized, wow, I was listening to you read. This has become a family affair. So my parents are on. They say, amazing job. Super proud of you. Oh. Yeah. So I guess we're going to go. You want to take some questions from the audience?
Yeah, sure. Would love to.
Okay. So I think we have some. Okay. So I guess when we were talking about process, I think Bethany wants a little bit more detail about that. So about just creating this super real world and all the details in it.
So that is, it's a lot of work. I have documents where I write up stuff about like their economy, the magic, what kind of stories they tell each other. And a lot of this doesn't even make it onto the page, but I'm thinking about it when I'm writing. And I feel like some of that comes through. I also think a lot about how to make a world feel lived in, and what details make a place feel lived in. So, you know, just things like, what does it smell like? What does it feel like? What do the characters see? And how do they describe their world? One of the techniques that I use often is to make sure that the metaphors are in line with the world that they're living in. So, for example, if you were living in the Wild West, you might see something was as fast as a freight train. But for my world, that doesn't exist. Sorry, it's my cat. So,
those streets were off.
Yeah. So I would say, something like, like as fast as like a sea serpent swims or something like that. So just little things to make it feel like it is an entire real world that is just as real as ours. And I do have trouble keeping track of some of this stuff sometimes. So I did start my own private wiki that I can add details to, so I can go back and refer to it. I do find out how inconsistent I'm being when I go through copy edits, and the copy editor is like, "Did you mean this?" Or I think
that's amazing that they can catch all that too. And you're like, "Let me refer to my notes." Their tax system is totally different.
They are amazing because they actually create this entire document that has all the stuff that you've all your made up words on it, and what's capitalized and what's the style for your book. So that is something that I refer to as well. It's a lot. It's a lot of work. And hopefully it carries through to the rest of the series.
Well, I guess that's why I was asking before, how can you not get confused between our world and that world? Because I just feel like I would be so immersed in that world that I would start speaking their language or something.
I do get confused from book to book, so I have to be careful now. That when I'm talking about things, I'm not revealing stuff that has happened in book 2 or book 3, because I joke that when you're a writer, you're constantly living in the past and in the future, because my paperback just came out at the end of March. So I was doing promotional stuff for that. And while I was doing promotional stuff for that, I was working on my copy edits and my proofs for book 2, and then also drafting book 3. So it's easy to get those confused.
And also because you have so many point of views as well. I mean, just in this first book, you have 4 point of views. So
there's actually 5.
So to keep them all
2 of them are in one story. So
to keep them all in line as well. I think Ian's on too, and he had a question for you.
Okay. Hey, Ian.
He said, "Now that you're a mom, how would you raise your children to follow their passions and seek better diversity and representation?"
Oh gosh, that's such a hard question. I mean, I feel like I want to raise my daughter to, be familiar with her Chinese background. At the same time, it's I feel like I am not as good with some of those things as I would like to be. I had learned Mandarin when I was a kid, and I don't I haven't spoken it in forever. So I've been trying to brush up so I can at least teach her how to pronounce things. As far as diversity and representation, I mean, I definitely want to read her books that reflect the diversity of the world around us. I don't want her to feel like she's limited. I know it's hard as a parent where you want to see your kids succeed. I know with my parents, when it was oh, I want to be an artist or a writer, it was very don't do that, you're not going to make any money. And I it's funny growing older how now as a mother, I understand that perspective a lot, where it's you really want your kids to be successful, and even though you want them to do what they love, you don't want them to have an unrealistic expectation. So yeah, I don't know. That's a really complicated question. I just hope that she has a lot of good examples around her. I mean, I have a very diverse friend group. I hope that I can always live in a very diverse area. I know when I was growing up, we partially lived in upstate New York for a while, and it was not very diverse. I think I was the only half Asian person there that I really knew. So that was weird, just being misidentified all the time. And I don't know how it's going to be for my daughter, because she is a quarter Chinese. So who knows?
I guess Maria had a question. Have you ever thought of going back and publishing a book about all the backstories?
Oh gosh, I mean, sometimes I think about stuff like that because there is a very like rich history in the world,
Mhm.
and there are a lot of things that occur before this story takes place with other characters. However, I have that like new and shiny temptation all the time. So, I mean, the next series I'm going to write is not going to be set in the same world. I don't know. Maybe I'll come back and revisit this one at some point, especially because there are like other islands mentioned that the Empire doesn't necessarily encounter very often. I have background for those islands, but yeah, I don't know. That's a problem for future me. once I write the next series, and then someday if I feel like coming back and revisiting this world, I may do that.
Do you have any information about your second book, about like publishing dates or when people
I
can
do.
pre-order?
I have a publishing date. I think, oh, I'd have to double check, but I think in the US it's coming out on the 9th. It's up for pre-order already on like all the sites that you would get books from, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, indie bookstores. But yeah, and the cover has not been released yet. I have seen some very pretty things. I think people will,
Awesome.
I know I've seen people that are like, oh, when are we going to see the cover? And I'm like, I don't know. I haven't seen the final cover yet, but I think
Is
from
it
what
the
I've
same
seen,
artist who did the first one, or?
it is the same artist.
Okay.
Yeah. From what I've seen, I think people will be very pleased. I'm very pleased with what it's looking like so far. So.
And then did you ever consider illustrating yourself? Because people might not know, but you're an amazing illustrator as well.
That was like one of my childhood dreams that I realized was unrealistic as I got older. Because
I still think they're pretty amazing. Yeah.
well, that's very nice of you, Yvonne. But like I'm like not on the same level.
Okay.
I have a realistic view of my skills, and like I'm like a fair artist, and I've done it professionally, but I'm not like at the level of these book cover artists that are not only doing it professionally, but doing so many of them, and they have like that skill for having the correct kind of composition that you need for a book cover. So yeah, I mean, I've done some drawings and paintings of my characters that have been used in some promotional materials. I know they sent out little postcards of the character art that I did with the Goldsboro special edition of the book, but which was cool. I'm like, well, that's
that's
close
really
enough
cool.
for
Yeah.
me. Close enough to my childhood dream, right? But yeah, I don't think I would do as nearly as good a job as the artist.
Or how about like all the geography
in
the inside cover, like all the geography of
the
island.
the map. Oh, so
yeah, the map. Yeah.
They do ask, like, could you send us a map so that they like can have something to work off of? So I did do that, and I think it's like it's still sitting on the second level of my coffee table and has been chewed on by my cat. So it's not. It's like, it's like a little sketch, but it's not like to the beautiful production value of what has been done inside the book.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. That was such a treat.
I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah. And thank you all to our audience for joining us at OCA Reads. And we hope you can join us again next Tuesday, May 25th. We're having the Tucson Mayor, Regina Romero, do a book reading of Read to Me, which is about the Japanese incarceration during World War II. And if you enjoyed this program and want to support us, please donate to us in our Give in May campaign, which is a fundraiser modeled after Giving Tuesday for AAPI nonprofits. And that's on all of our websites, on our Facebook page. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Andrea. Bye.
Thank you so much.